Zone 0B. That was the classification. 4 characters stamped onto a 1,200-hectare survey map by the Department of Environmental Forestry in the winter of 2011. Not a warning, not a proposal, a declaration. The Blackwood Tract was, in the language of the official record, biologically dead. I accepted that. For 7 years, most people who knew this land accepted it. The narrative was coherent, and frankly, it was supported by the data. Heavy metal saturation throughout the topsoil. Invasive monoculture scrub consuming the understory. A 2013 independent toxicology survey that found no measurable earthworm activity across the entire sector. When a landscape loses its earthworms, what you're left with isn't soil anymore. It's chemistry. And the official position, the position of the forestry conglomerate, the state environmental agency, the remediation contractors who had already been quietly budgeted to begin work in the early 2030s, was that nothing alive was going back into the Blackwood Tract without decades of expensive, highly managed, chemically assisted intervention. That was the record. I want to be precise about that because the record matters here. Then, in the spring of last year, I was working through satellite image arrays from 2021, routine archival work, nothing targeted, and I pulled up the Blackwood sector out of procedural habit. What I found there required me to look at the image 3 separate times before I was willing to write anything down. In the exact center of the dead zone, where the canopy had been documented as completely collapsed and the soil classified as structurally inert, there was a fracture of deep, dense green. Not a thin line, not an artifact of the imaging. A living, expanding bloom, spreading outward from the interior of a landscape that the state had officially declared incapable of sustaining life. Someone had been inside that perimeter. Something had changed the dirt. I want you to hold that image, that green fracture in the center of a dead map, because before we can begin to understand what it means, we have to spend some time with what we were told was impossible, and why the people who told us that may have had very specific reasons for wanting us to believe it. The paper trail begins, as many of these things do, not with a dramatic leak or a whistleblower, but with something almost mundane. A weight log. In the fall of 2018, a private livestock transport firm operating under a regional agricultural services license filed a series of internal shipping manifests for what the paperwork described as ungulate relocation, domestic agricultural. Standard language. The kind of entry that moves through a filing system without catching on anything.
Right there.
4 crates. Combined payload, approximately 3,800 kilograms. Destination recorded as an access road, officially decommissioned, officially unmaintained, running along the southwestern boundary of the Blackwood Tract. I want to be careful here, because I'm not in a position to verify the chain of custody for these documents, and I want to be honest about that. What I can tell you is what the documents themselves show, and what they show is a set of anomalies that do not resolve cleanly. The first, there is no corresponding public expenditure. No budget line, no procurement record, no environmental impact authorization. In any legitimate livestock transfer touching a state-classified biohazard zone, you would expect a filing architecture that runs to dozens of documents. What exists here is 3 pages. The second, the delivery timestamp. The manifests log arrival at 11:47 p.m. on September 14, 2018. A date that, when cross-referenced with regional utility records, falls inside a 6-hour window during which the local monitoring grid experienced what was logged as an unscheduled power interruption across a 40-kilometer radius. Hold that detail, I'll come back to it. Nearly 4 tons of living weight moved in darkness through a gate in a fence surrounding land the state had declared incapable of supporting life. No public record, no tracking data, no named recipient. If the Blackwood Tract was an unsalvageable biohazard, someone was treating it like a laboratory. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. series goes to places most channels won't approach, and the pattern we're building toward is significantly larger than one fence line in one dead forest. Now, back to Blackwood, because the question of what was inside those crates is only the beginning of what doesn't add up. To understand what happened inside the Blackwood tract, you have to set aside the instinct to look for a dramatic intervention. There was no remediation crew, no chemical neutralizer injected into the water table. What the evidence suggests happened was simultaneously simpler and more difficult to accept. 4 large animals moved through a poisoned landscape, and by doing what large animals do, began to dismantle it. Let me be precise about the mechanism, because this is where the science becomes genuinely unsettling. The dominant ground cover inside the Blackwood perimeter following the 2011 defoliation program was a dense monoculture of invasive reed canary grass, a species that, under heavy metal soil conditions, forms an interlocking root mat so compressed that it functions less like vegetation and more like a seal. It suppresses. It excludes. It holds the existing toxicity in place by preventing the soil column from turning, from breathing, from interacting with rainfall. The standard remediation literature treats this mat as one of the primary obstacles to recovery, and the standard solution involves mechanical rotivation across the full affected area at a projected cost, in the Blackwood sector specifically, of somewhere between $4 and $7 million. A European bison weighs between 600 and 900 kilograms. At that mass, moving at even a moderate pace through dense ground cover, the physical compression and tearing force applied to root systems is not trivial. It is, the evidence suggests, sufficient to break the mat. But the wallowing is what I keep returning to. When a bison wallows, grinding its body into the earth with its full weight, churning the soil with shoulders and hooves, it doesn't simply disturb the surface. It punctures. In locations with hard clay caps of the type documented extensively across the Blackwood sector, a wallow can breach the cap entirely, exposing what soil scientists refer to as the predisturbance seed layer. Dormant seed material, sometimes centuries old, that has been waiting beneath the toxicity for exactly this kind of mechanical interruption. The forest didn't recover despite what was inside those crates. It may have recovered because of precisely how those animals chose to rest. What I cannot tell you is whether the people who authorized that September delivery understood this, whether they predicted it, whether they were testing a hypothesis they had already proven somewhere else. That question matters more than it might seem, because Blackwood, it turns out, was not the first place someone ran this experiment. The first parallel site appeared in a corporate tax, filing from a timber holding company registered in Oregon. A 2017 depreciation entry for livestock acquisition and transport, non-commercial classification. A phrasing that has no standard meaning in agricultural accounting. Itemized against a parcel in the Cascade foothills that the Washington State Department of Ecology had, in 2014, designated an environmental remediation priority zone following a decades-long history of clear-cut operations and documented chromium contamination. The entry was small. Easy to move past. I almost did. Then I found the Romanian filing. A forestry conglomerate operating in the Eastern Carpathians logged an identical expense category: non-commercial ungulate transfer, restricted land classification. In a 2016 subsidiary report, cross-reference to a 430-hectare defoliation site outside Brasov that had been formally closed to independent environmental monitoring since 2013. The site does not appear in any regional conservation registry. It does not appear in any rewilding database. It does not appear anywhere in the public record as a site of active biological interest. Let me say that again more carefully. 3 sites, 3 separate corporate entities operating in 3 different regulatory environments on 2 different continents, all moving animals, unlisted, unbudgeted, unannounced, into landscapes officially classified as biologically compromised, all in the same 4-year window between 2016 and 2019. And in each case, within 18 months of the transfers, the public environmental monitoring stations assigned to those sectors went offline. Not decommissioned, not defunded, simply offline. I'm not saying this is coordination. I want to be precise about what the evidence does and does not show. What I can say is that coincidence, at this geographic scale and this documentary specificity, requires its own explanation. 3 nations, no shared public record, all suppressing the same category of information. What I couldn't explain yet was why the people who had seen this firsthand weren't talking. I looked for them, and what I found was that some of them had been made very certain that they shouldn't. 2:11 p.m. There were 2 field biologists assigned to the Blackwood perimeter in the spring of 2020. I'm not going to use their names here, and I want to be transparent about why. Both individuals are currently bound by active non-disclosure agreements, and nomming them would accomplish nothing except potentially exposing them to further legal consequences. What I can tell you is what the documentary record shows before those agreements were signed. The first researcher filed a set of unauthorized field notes in March of 2020. Unauthorized because they fell outside the scope of the contracted survey work, which was limited to perimeter soil assessment at designated access points. The notes documented something the researcher had not been asked to look for and had no institutional reason to expect. A confirmed acoustic signature of Strix occidentalis, the northern spotted owl, recorded on 2 separate evenings from a position approximately 300 meters inside the Blackwood fence line. A forest officially classified as structurally degraded scrubland. A species that requires complex, multi-layered old-growth habitat to nest. The second researcher, working independently on a water table proximity study, filed a supplementary report in June of the same year noting anomalous nitrogen cycling patterns in soil samples taken near what the report described as large mammal disturbance sites. A phrase that, in context, can only mean one thing. Both researchers were reassigned within 60 days of filing. Both signed NDAs within 90. I want to be slow and careful here, because what I am not saying is that these individuals were punished for telling the truth. What I am saying is that the institutional response to 2 independent field observations that contradicted the official classification of this land, was rapid, legally precise, and complete. No rebuttal, no counter-study, no public acknowledgement that the notes had ever been filed. The observations were not disproven, they were buried. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't encountered elsewhere, consider sharing this investigation. The further this scrutiny reaches, the more difficult institutional silence becomes to maintain. Now, back to Blackwood, because silencing the people is only half of what was done. The other half was done to the land itself. In November of 2022, the Blackwood Tract ceased to exist as a public entity. That is not rhetorical. It is the precise legal outcome of a reclassification petition filed by the parent logging conglomerate with the Regional Land Use Authority on September 3rd of that year, exactly 4 months after the second field biologist signed their non-disclosure agreement. The petition requested, and was granted, a formal redesignation of the entire 1,200-hectare parcel from Public Forest Reserve to Critical Industrial Infrastructure Territory. The distinction is not administrative, it is a firewall. Under the Infrastructure Territory designation, the parcel is permanently exempted from the Environmental Monitoring Access Act, the legislative mechanism by which independent researchers, public health bodies, and regional government agencies are legally entitled to conduct air, water, and soil testing on public land. That right, which had existed for every citizen and institution with a legitimate research interest in the Blackwood sector for decades, was extinguished in a single filing. No public consultation, No environmental impact review of the reclassification itself. A procedural pathway that was designed, the evidence suggests, for situations involving critical energy infrastructure and active industrial hazard repurposed here to cover a forest. Let me say that plainly. The legal instrument used to seal Blackwood from public scrutiny was written to protect oil pipelines and chemical processing facilities. It is now protecting trees. What I cannot tell you is who approved this internally or at what level the decision was made. The petition lists a single signatory from the conglomerate's legal affairs division. That individual has not responded to any form of contact. Remember that the reclassification came in 2022. The soil samples showing a 40% reduction in heavy metal toxicity near Bison wallows are also dated 2022. The sequence of those two events is not something I'm prepared to call coincidental. The people had been silenced, the land had been reclassified, and then on the eastern ridge of the tract, something new began to be built. The construction permits were filed under a subsidiary name I had not encountered anywhere else in this investigation. A holding company registered 18 months prior, with no operational history, no listed employees, and a registered address that resolves to a mail forwarding service in a commercial district outside the region. The permits describe the project as a materials processing and data management facility. They list no primary contractor. They list no projected completion date. What the permits do list is a footprint, 4,300 square meters of enclosed structure, sited on the eastern ridge of the Blackwood Tract, with direct access to the internal road network that runs along the perimeter fence. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I cannot tell you what is being built. I have no insider knowledge of the facility's purpose, and I am not going to speculate beyond what the available evidence suggests. What I can tell you is what I observed from the nearest publicly accessible vantage point, which is a forestry access road approximately 800 meters from the construction boundary. Lighting rigs, a concrete foundation larger than the permit footprint implies. And unmarked vehicles, no corporate livery, no contractor markings, entering and leaving the access road on a schedule that suggests overnight operation. Behind that activity, visible from elevation on a clear day, the forest continues, expanding, deepening. The green fracture I found in a 2021 satellite image is no longer a fracture. It is, by current estimation, the dominant land cover across the central third of the Blackwood sector. Step back from the individual pieces of this investigation for a moment and look at the shape of what they form together. Step back from the individual pieces of this investigation for a moment and look at the shape of what they form together. A landscape declared biologically dead. Animals moved into it in darkness, without a public record, without a budget, without a name attached. The landscape responds. The data confirms what the official record said was impossible. The people who documented that confirmation are legally silenced. The land itself is reclassified out of public reach, and on its border, construction begins at night under a company that did not exist 2 years ago. That is the sequence. I want you to hold that sequence in its entirety, because each element in isolation has an explanation. Together, they form something that I have been sitting with for months and cannot resolve. The question I keep returning to, the one this entire investigation has been building toward, is this. If the results at Blackwood represent a failure, why is anyone still paying attention to it? You don't silence biologists over a failed experiment. You don't reclassify land under infrastructure law to hide something that didn't work. You don't build an unmarked facility on the edge of a dead zone unless the dead zone is no longer dead. And unless what killed it back to life is something you very much do not want the public to price into the remediation industry. I don't have the answer. I want to be honest about that. What I have is a pattern, and the pattern is coherent in a way that I find genuinely difficult to dismiss. 4 animals, a poisoned forest, a 40% reduction in heavy metal toxicity, 2 silenced scientists, a legal reclassification that erased the public's right to look, and a facility going up at night beside a forest that was officially declared incapable of sustaining life and is now sustaining it anyway. If you have thoughts, theories, or, and I mean this, any material that bears on what's happening on that eastern ridge, the comments are the right place. The scrutiny this series generates is the only thing that makes continued investigation possible. The next thread I'm pulling leads to the shipping manifests of those unmarked trucks. I've been putting it off. I don't think I can anymore. Zone 0B, that was the classification. Someone decided the forest was dead. And then, apparently, someone else decided to find out if they were right.